Perspectives, Finding Common Ground, a podcast series that brings together a panel of thought leader perspectives as a forum to socialize and problem solve education technology issues with the goal to ultimately find common ground.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Perspectives, Finding Common Ground. My name is Patrick Devaney, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this episode today, where we're going to be talking about a topic that is getting a lot of attention in the news. It's affecting people personally. It's creating some fear, some panic. There's all sorts of concerns around this topic, and we want to take the chance to drill down into it a little bit, add some calmness, and think about how we react. Change is inevitable, so we're looking for ways to deal with this sanely and effectively. And I've got three fabulous guests here to help us talk through this today. I think I'll let them introduce themselves, and I'll start with you, Julia. You're up in the upper left-hand corner of my screen, so you're first.
Sure thing. My name is Julia Fallon. I'm the executive director of CEDA. We are a professional nonprofit association that represents state-level educational technology and digital learning leaders that you find housed at state education agencies from across this country.
Thanks, and welcome, Julia. Christina, can you go next?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Ishmael. My pronouns are she and her. I lead my own consulting firm at Ishmael Consulting. And prior to this, I was the former deputy director of the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Educational Technology.
Fantastic. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Keith.
Thank you, Patrick. Keith Kruger, CEO of COSN, the Consortium for School Networking. We're a 30-year-old plus nonprofit association that was founded just as the internet in schools started, and we worked hard at those early days to get a funding source like E-Rate, and so we're still here trying to figure out what the future looks like.
Great. Well, without further ado, I guess it's time. Let's just dive into this a little bit. And I think the first question that I would throw out really refers to the department itself. There's a then and now. It's been around for a while. Aspects of the federal government have looked at education or have been involved in education for a very long time. But the Department of Education as we know it was formed in 1979. Let's talk a little bit about the role and the difference of the role of the Department of Ed itself versus Congress and state governments. So how are these functions today? What are they and how do they differ? And anybody want to start with that? Maybe you, Christina, because you actually have been in the department. Why don't you start if you could?
I have. I've had the incredible honor to serve at the U.S. Department of Education in two different administrations, both in the Office of Ed Tech, but in the Obama administration back in 2016, as well as the Biden-Harris administration, as I previously mentioned. I was also a member of the Biden-Harris transition team back in 2020 for the recommendations for the Department of Education for the Biden administration. So really, it comes down to the agency itself as a civil rights agency. Most folks don't necessarily see it that way, but that is the largest function. So civil rights, I would also say funding, federal student aid plays a huge part of that, education research, and then more than anything, accountability and oversight, particularly for the effective use of taxpayer dollars.
Great.
And I will add, actually, there's some other laws that are statutorily required, right? And numerous programs. And I think those of us in the K-12 space will understand what Title I is for low-income students, Title II for principals and educators, and also for students under the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Act. These are mandated by federal law that are not part of the law that actually created the Department of Ed. And there's lots of things there that happen that are requirements around those programs from a statutory requirement.
And I think I would just, from a large scale perspective, I mean, education is a state and local kind of responsibility. Most of the funding comes from states and from districts, but about, I think it's 9% or so, something like that at the federal level, but extremely important in the area of high poverty students, in the area of special needs kids, and of course in the higher ed space of college and career. But I would say that from the perspective of education technology, the U.S. Department of Education has played an important role in kind of laying out a vision, helping states and districts see where we want to go.
So I want to do a little bit of an add-on to that, and I'd love to hear your perspective on. There's an argument that's behind this recent effort to dismantle or reduce the department. What is that argument mostly based on, or what's your understanding of what that argument is?
I'm trying to
I
think of a
think
way to answer this.
It's not a judgment if it's right or wrong. It's
Right.
a question of what is the argument.
From what I understand, from what my former colleagues, including appointees from Ed 44 and Ed 46, who are all trying to help kind of support everyone right now in organizing, but also helping those that were affected by the most recent reduction in force, what they understand and what we all understand is that there is considered a federal overreach by the U.S. Department of Education. And that it contradicts the idea of state and local control.
Returning rights to states. However, the states will still be on the hook for coordination and whatnot, even if the money goes directly to them. And the folks that are career folks that work in the Department of Ed are those that have really deep understanding of how to navigate through that statutory requirements and helping states to actually be able to use the monies that you do receive. And in essence, really, it's a supplement sort of model, not a supplant, meaning that states use this money to supplement things that they're already doing for their citizens of their states. And again, that not having those folks that help navigate that is a huge loss to the system as a whole.
Julia, I think you mentioned there's some legislative responsibility here, which is different from the oversight and the coordination that the Department of Education does. And I think a lot of folks don't necessarily understand that Congress actually funds these programs. And the risk is not necessarily that the money goes away, but it gets distributed in a different fashion, and the coordination of that distribution changes. So how do you view the potential disruption that's caused by changing that method of distribution? What are the risks in that?
Well, from a state perspective, and this is like states, I like to think of state education agencies as sort of like being a little bit more certain in times of uncertainty, right? We're designed to be a little bit slower. We take a little bit longer or a little bit, hopefully methodical about things. But with the elimination of, or the proposed elimination of the Department of Ed, there's just some uncertainty that will now come into play. If funding sources go to other agencies, now the SEA will have to create relationships with those agencies, navigate their particular requirements and processes. It's just states are going to need to be able to collaborate on a more consistent funding and program management strategies. Again, it's easy to work with one agency versus 4 agencies for the same thing that one agency was providing to you. And what we're really concerned about is some disparities that will happen between states, because depending on state leadership and how SEAs are organized, it might cause a little bit more of that disparity to happen because your state may not have the resources in order to bring on the extra people it's going to be to manage these new relationships and everything else. And I do think that there'll be some significant delays just because it's not going to happen overnight that we can do that. So I think it will exacerbate sort of some things across. So again, states are going to have to collaborate to be able to develop these consistent approaches, but that's the biggest loss. And thinking about efficiency and effectiveness, we really want to be able to maximize those dollars to be going to schools and students and educators and not necessarily tied up in the administration of all of these programs and managing all of the process.
How does that impact your world, Keith?
Well, I think in areas like privacy of student data, the U.S. Department of Ed has provided technical support. Now, actually, they haven't indicated whether that will that has not yet been on the chopping block. But if you're cutting out half of the people working there, that's an example where we might see a significant reduction. We've, of course, in the last year, and Christina was part of some of these efforts to help provide a vision for around things like AI in K-12. That sort of that often called the National Ed Tech Plan, which Julia and Christina were very involved in the last round, which I have always thought is less of a plan and more of a vision around helping identify what could be. And so I think some of those coordinating opportunities are being lost. It's certainly possible I'm certain that some states and many districts will pick up the pace, but without the variance will be even greater because we don't have kind of a coordinating function at the federal level. And just as a sidebar, I have to say, although you've been focused, Patrick, on the Department of Ed, the largest funding source for ed tech doesn't come from the Department of Ed. It comes from the FCC, the E-rate program, and plus a lot of other resources. For instance, on supporting school districts on cybersecurity happens over at Homeland Security through CISA. And unfortunately, we learned last week that federal support for cybersecurity, free or low-cost services has been eliminated. I have to say, we think that's just downright short-sighted and counterintuitive to what we see as the kind of emergency situation. Ironically, COSIN had partnered with CISA and MSISAC to put out a report the week before talking about all the terrible incidents that have happened in the last 18 months and how desperately this was needed. And so this is counterintuitive. And, earlier today, I was, the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing a court case that could upend the E-rate and universal service. So I think we have to, as ed tech leaders, be focused not only on the Department of Ed, but on all the things that are happening, and they're happening so rapidly that it's hard to keep track.
That's a fabulous comment to make, Keith. I think it's so important that, we think of this in the context of education, and the natural tendency is to say the Department of Education, but you bring up two critical pieces with E-rate and CISA that are core to supporting education technology. And both of it, it seems like everything these days is subject to change, and it's all impacting our education system and ultimately our kids. So thanks for expanding that perspective on this. Do we have organizations, states, and or others that are ready to step up and help fill in some of what's going to be missing as this continues to go forward? It does.
Well, I think the organizations on this call are deeply there to help, but there is no way that CETA and COSIN can replace the sort of staffing and financial support to school systems across the country. That's just not possible. We can provide vision, we can provide community, we can provide a professional association, but we certainly can't replace the investment in research, for instance. And that's something we haven't talked about yet. But the research aspects of the U.S. Department of Ed and at the National Science Foundation have been decimated over the last 2 weeks. So that's problematic in terms of having longitudinal information, and I'm not sure where that gets picked up or how it does. Maybe someone brighter on this call can answer that.
I think we're all going to be stepping up in our own ways to support our membership communities, but also and the folks that we serve. I think I want to be able to also tell people that this is not a red or a blue thing. There are great things happening in all states. It's particularly in the area of ed tech and innovation. And we want to make sure that we don't lose the gains that we have gotten, especially during the pandemic. That really highlighted a lot of the divides that were out there, according to the 2024 National Ed Tech Plan. But we want to be able to still support the states and the districts that are doing great work and not have them kind of have to backpedal in order to go forward again. And as a country, if we want to be a leader in innovation and in all of the places, even including preparing students for, post-secondary success, we have to be thinking about this systemically. And I feel, again, that what's happened in the last couple of weeks is not a strategic or a well thought out sort of plan. I get that we may need to make improvements here and there and help the system, but this is not necessarily the way that it should have been approached.
And I would just add on to that all of these nonprofits, whether it's COSIN and CETA or an ISTE, you name it, the Learning Accelerator, all of these folks, we saw them all step up during the beginning of COVID, and we already are seeing them step up now to fill in the gaps. But I will also speak, from the firsthand experience that I have, and even Julia would have this as well, but we are former state agency employees as well. And so knowing that state agencies also run on really lean staffing and lean budgets. I was a team of one running the entire state of Nebraska's ed tech. I didn't have a budget. And so these are also the things that, like, yes, we can talk about a block grant back down to the states, but we also need to be realistic about the fact that they don't necessarily have the staffing for being able to execute on this as well. And so it's a huge concern.
And Patrick, I'd like to turn the question on you. You work with many companies. So this is a moment, it seems to me, of high uncertainty. My perception is that industry doesn't like uncertainty. So are you seeing the private sector who supports K-12 in terms of education and technology, how are they viewing these changes?
Great question, Keith. You want to switch roles here? I think we can.
It's easier to ask questions than to give answers.
And it's a very appropriate question. I do see, and particularly with my role, my primary role at ClassLink is to work with vendors. We build integrations to make technology easier and safer for schools to use in the process of education and for people to access equitably the tools that are available. I do see in that role, I see a lot of companies that are tightening their belt. I see companies are scaling back. I see companies are being far more restrictive about their engagement with educators and how far they're willing to go, how much risk they're willing to take. And on the surface, you say, well, that's what happens. The economy goes up, the economy goes down, and there's the natural expansion and contraction. But when we're talking about education, the education system needs the investment from outside organizations, needs the investment from companies, we're not talking about private equity and venture capital. Yeah, we need that. They're a little bit more in it for themselves, I guess. But I think so many of the education companies that are there started as mom and pop, started as teachers, started as administrators in a school, and they're there because they believe there's a higher cause. They're not there just to make money. They're there to help and improve the system. And I see that's tapped, that's inhibited by the kind of uncertainty that we're facing right now. How do I make a long-term investment with my company if I don't even know who to go to try to promote it or sell it because they can't, pay for it or leverage the benefit to be able to share with others and create new opportunities? So I guess did I answer that for you?
Yes,
Okay. I do think, though, that it's not just impacting, and that's our audience. That's really the purpose of this podcast as well. We want to hear the perspective of all of those that are part of this.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately we look for things that we agree on and we understand together, because if we lean into those, we have a greater chance of making positive contribution. Instead of worrying about the noise or the conflict, let's see what we can do to improve the outcomes. Now I'm going to shift it back around, okay? Well, and some of that, I think, we talk about, this is about innovation because the companies are really doing a lot of the innovation. How about the equity? And I heard Julia and Christina both kind of address this. What happens to our ability to provide equity to learners across the country if the oversight of the Department of Ed goes away or is distributed? Let's assume that there's the same amount of energy that goes in, but it's distributed to the states. What happens now with learners? Where's the disparity? Where's the risk?
I think, again, it goes back to the leadership, especially at the SEA, the state education agency levels, of where their priorities are, right? And where they see technology supporting those initiatives. We often don't see state chiefs coming out with digital learning or, modern day learning as their priority. It's about raising their math scores or chronic absenteeism. But how does technology actually support those goals? And how do you create space in your cabinet and your conversations about how technology can go farther? And states are kind of all over the place. I mean, a lot of people come to CETA and they'll be like, oh, well, Wyoming's the same size as X, state. And I'm like, well, no, they're all set up a little bit differently and they all have their different flavors and everything else. But states are going to have to take a lot more responsibility. And the question is, their leadership going to take on that responsibility and see technology and how it can help innovate and modernize our system? Are they going to see the value of that? And we do see some pockets of that already, but I mean, again, it's them all. We don't want to create disparities, right? We don't want to have one state that goes out way further than everybody else, or we leave states behind in essence. Now I'm joking around, like leave no state behind as really a child behind. But like Christina has said, and what I've experienced too, I had spent 17 and a half years at our state education agency here in Washington State. The capacity is a real challenge. I mean, we don't go into state government because we wanted to work for state government for X number of years. We went in there because there was a higher calling and we believe in public education and what it can bring to everybody. And it's not, I know equity seems to be a very dirty word right now. And it makes me sad because it's not just about I always use the example of my kids as currently a sophomore in high school. And if she has to take biology because it's a graduation requirement, great. But if Mrs. Smith, and her last name starts with F, she gets put into a class with Mrs. Smith who uses technology, but then her best friend whose last name starts with an M, is in another section of biology with a completely different teacher and they're not using technology, that's an inequitable, that doesn't set her best friends up for success as much as my kid in the same school. I'm not even talking about the school across, a town in a different area that's less resourced or a district that's next door that has more resources. We're talking about in schools. And I want every student to have, we no longer can have as a nice to have in order to be successful post-secondary in this country, regardless of your career path, you're using technology. And now you're probably going to be using AI as part of your work life. So how do we make sure that they have those experiences in schools and make it a modern learning experience? But states are they have capacity issues. They're still obligated to meet statutory requirements, like I said before, unless Congress decides to change some things there and everything else. But the federal government has historically helped address those disparities and make it a little bit more of an even playing field and plugging in where the states needs that supplemental kind of help.
And I'll throw on some statistics that we have just to kind of validate that or corroborate that. So 6 states require on more than 20% of their budget to come from the federal government. And that includes Alaska, Montana, South Dakota, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Kentucky. 9.8 million students in rural schools depend on that federal support to bridge when they have more limited local tax bases. And then if we're talking about the federal student aid side of things, 6.6 million students rely on Pell Grants. And so if that should happen to move to the Small Business Association, now that means there's one other player or one other agency that has to be brought into the state-based kind of education conversations. That also pertains to the National Science Foundation, who funds the development of a lot of curriculum that are already in a lot of these conversations. However, just even the experience that I had leading the Office of Ed Tech, when we were working with the Surgeon General's office over at the Health and Human Services, there were like 5 different folks or 5 different offices, not only the Surgeon General's office, but then we had to work with this person over here on mental health. We had to work with this person over here and trying to coordinate that even as just one office. That onus is going to be placed on the states, who again are dealing with the capacity issues to begin with, or folks that may not have any sort of background knowledge in this either.
Patrick, you mentioned innovation and how do we think about that? And COSIN's done a lot of work over the last 16 years called Driving K-12 Innovation, which is really about how do we have a thoughtful conversation? Because I think technology is a means; it's not an end. And if we really want to think about innovation, what are the big problems we're trying to solve? We call them hurdles. And every year we identify we get a group of experts from around the world, and we identify what are the top 3 hurdles that you're trying to get over. We also look at how's the world changing. We call them accelerators. What are the top 3? And it's only last and final that we actually look at the technology. We call them tech enablers. And I think from a logic model, that's a way to help school district teachers, leaders, principals, parents have a conversation. Not that these 9 trends in hurdles, accelerators, and tech enablers are the answer, but rather to spark a conversation in your own school district, or state. There's clearly not going to be, and never has been, kind of a national, this is the answer of the hurdles we're trying to solve. It's going to take a lot more work at a state and local and even school level.
Let's shift a little bit and talk about what have we learned from past kind of shifts? Have there been shifts like this in the past? What's worked? What hasn't worked? What have we taken away from them? And even maybe you have examples internationally of what governments have done to try to address some of these challenges.
Under the No Child Left Behind version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we had dedicated funding for educational technology that was there from when it was acted and then implemented. And that's when you saw states really coming together. And I think CETA was born out of sort of that onus and whatnot, to come together, to collaborate, to learn from one another. Again, there isn't teams of ed tech people at all SEAs. There are usually a handful of folks, 1 to 2. Some teams are lucky and they have 6 or 7, but there's small teams of us that were sort of doing this cross-functional work within our agencies to help people really understand how technology can support the chief's goals and the SEA's goals. In 2011, though, because we had a hard time really ferreting out how technology really supported all of these things, and from a research perspective, funding went away. So we talk about the laws, but there's also appropriations, right? We can drive change also by how we fund and invest on the funding side. And what you started to see was a disparity between states that continued to invest, right? They picked up the slack, they stepped up. And Utah is a perfect example of this, right? They continued to invest after 2011 in the ed tech space as a means to support their ideas of portion of a learner, post-secondary success, workforce development. And what was interesting thing is, even when the Every Student Succeeds Act that became enacted and replaced No Child Left Behind in 2015, when the pandemic hit, Utah literally went on spring break and came back and said, we're good. Because they were the one state that continued to just see the value of technology and how it underpinned a lot of the things that they were doing. A bunch of us, myself included, because I was still at the state office when this was taking place, is we were getting pulled into we lost funding in Washington State in 2013. They no longer were continuing to fund a separate set ed tech office. And, I got pulled to do policy all of a sudden. I'm writing policy, even though I'm sitting in Title II, just trying to catch us up to get to a place where we could support what was happening during the pandemic. So, and I know there's other cases of all of that, disparities of where folks are, but we saw already a split there. Now, thankfully, during the pandemic, there was a huge investment by the federal government, right, and states to close those gaps in terms of devices and connectivity and whatnot. And I feel like we leapfrogged, you know what I mean, and made up a good portion of the years that we lost. But again, now we're afraid with the elimination of the Office of Ed Tech. And funding, could be dicey after next year, right? We have a continuing resolution that gets us through this next funding year, but it could look like that again, where we have a disparity between states. And again, going back to, as a country, if we want to be competitive and we want to have post-secondary success for our students, regardless of career path, I'm not even talking about kids that are going to college, in automotive, if you're a farmer, you are using technology every day in your work and everything else, and they need to have those skills as well. And those are high wage kind of positions out there. And I really I'm a little bit surprised, given the rhetoric out there about, USA first and all of that kind of stuff, that this is not something that they are considering as a way to get us there for all students.
It's funny that you mention agriculture, Julia. One of my favorite stories from whenever I was in the administration was being in the same room with all of the cabinet secretaries. And I had the chance to meet Secretary Vilsack formerly from USDA. And we started talking about the technology that's in combines. And we're like, we need access to all of these types of things, and talking about agricultural science and how we can integrate technology in there. And so there are folks that understand that too. The innovation continues no matter which industry you may be interested in.
And I think, Patrick, you asked not only in the U.S., obviously things ebb and flow and change depending on what the priorities are, but there's things to learn from around the world. And we certainly have, we at COSIN have brought delegations with, Uruguay, made an investment in one-to-one back, whatever it was, 15 years ago. We went there very early before that was really happening in the United States. We looked at Portugal, which did a different sort of family consumer kind of approach. In New Zealand, they had earthquakes and they lost a lot of schools, and they decided to go to a new, different way of using technology and space as they recreated schools. So, I think there is a lot to learn around technology and innovation and solving problems, and we're going to have to be keeping an eye on what others are doing that we could learn from.
Thank you for that. I want to throw a different question in that I didn't kind of prompt for, but I have to wonder, and that is the role of philanthropy in education, and the possibility for that to help smooth some of these ups and downs. There's got to be some positives. There's also got to be some risks. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
Well, philanthropy has a big role to play around proof of concept. They are not probably going to be like a government in providing endless. So, whether it's a proof of concept or 2 or 3 or 4 year or 5 year, but we see that they do help us try new things. We're very excited about some new work we're doing with education service agencies around the country around our AI maturity model. But I know that has to become self-sustaining, or because the Gates Foundation is not going to support that, in 3 or 4 or 5 years. They're going to have moved on to a new priority. So I think that right now, philanthropy has a huge bridge role to play. And there's going to be endless needs that they're not going to be able to do everything, but clearly they have a big role to play.
And I want to add just maybe a challenge for our philanthropic partners and everything else is to think about how they can, with their strategies and their priorities, is how systemically it can change a system versus, narrowing it down and being so narrow that maybe people can't take advantage of it, or will have to, tailor or modify something that they want to do more systemically. They'll have to tailor it to be more, direct impact, because we definitely need to figure out how to make the system work better. And I think there's an opportunity for them during this bridge thing. I mean, again, for effectiveness and efficiency and everything else, is to challenge us as organizations and grantees to think more systemically about how everything works together.
The one downside, I'm sorry to be the downer, one downside is that you have all of these nonprofits or these educational organizations now all going for the same money. Not that has necessarily changed from before, but with the drastic reduction in federal funding, with grants and contracts cut, that means that they're all going towards philanthropy or corporate social responsibility, and they're all fighting for the same amount of dollars. And so that is something, like there have been a couple of foundations that have come forward and said, we're going to double our investment for the next 2 to 5 years. Like those are the types of commitments that we have seen more holistically from the philanthropy kind of sector for education within the past 4 to 6 weeks. And so I'm really curious to see if we'll see more of that coming in the next couple of months.
So what I'm hearing there is a leveling aspect, kind of a neutralizing aspect of philanthropy contributions can be very helpful. Show up more when the need is greater and back off a little bit when the need is not as high. But we don't ever want them to back off. Maybe.
No, we don't want them to back off. I'm like, no, we don't want to encourage that.
No, but I'm very encouraged by even like some of the things that we're doing. And I always joke around, like, they're not really sexy projects unless you're a policy person. Like, you know what I mean? But one of the things, we're really grateful for some funding that we got from the Google Foundation folks to come up with the Title II guide. And it's not just the guide on how to use Title II that we can distribute at ISTE, right? We're doing this in partnership with ISTE and Learning Forward, of course. But it's really because CETA houses a Title II collaborative. These are the state folks that administer these programs, support these programs. It's helping them really understand what good technology related professional learning looks like, so that they are going to approve these grants that LEAs are going to be asking for through federal funding, right? So, which is what an SEA does to administer. So the idea is to really create a system where a person that's not an ed tech person, but looking at how federal funding can be used in this particular title program for professional learning, that we are funding the types of projects we want to see that meet the letter of the law, and that hopefully we'll see an uptick in those teachers that are using technology as part of their instructional strategies in their classrooms.
I do have one more question kind of regarding where we go, but before we get into that, what are we not talked about here that's relevant in terms of how we optimize education through the use of technology and the potential disruption that is caused by the activity currently in Washington?
Now, to flip it, and it's sort of like what keeps me up at night. We've seen a lot of focus on cell phone bans and social media bans, which are, one can make the strong case that cell phones in the classroom, unless they're intentional, are a distraction. But what worries me is the broadening and calling that screen time debate. And especially with our school districts that have kind of rethought the way they deliver instruction, we're not being very precise in the debate about that. And there are growing concerns that I'm hearing, and I think we'll hear more about, should we be either ed tech has failed, or we ought to ban or keep track of minutes and hours of how much screen time the kids have in school. So I think that we're headed in for some challenging conversations around that. And, you can see how quickly the debate changed on cell phones over the last 2 years. And I think you could, unless we are, and I'm not saying that all ed tech has succeeded. I think we don't want to defend every use. We want to defend what is good and smart use and have a balanced conversation. But that, to me, is the area that I think we're going to need to be smarter and thoughtful and educate our leaders on how to have a balanced conversation about the role of technology.
I was going to add, we talked a little bit about research and whatnot, but also just data and like sort of accountability. The department really helped unify some data standards, right, in terms of its federal oversight, but it's going to be harder for states to make sort of those evidence-based decisions or data-driven decision making, which is what we want, right? We want research that shows us what's working, how we can use it better, just like any other practice out there. The medical field uses it. Lawyers are constantly like, it's a practice as well, but we won't have that standardization and that guidance for like data collection, and we need more of it, right? Like we're collecting a lot of data, but we also need to start using that data to be able to make predictions and lessen the uncertainty that's out there, or take a best practice somewhere and, elevate it so that other people can know about it and use it. And I worry about that's just a void that's gone. Again, short-sighted about how they could have done this in a different way, I guess, you know what I mean? To be a little bit more strategic about what they were trying to accomplish at the end of the day. So it's going to hinder that data-driven decision-making that we all want everybody to be using and making the rationale for.
Yeah. I think the news that Keith shared about CISA no longer supporting their efforts on K-12 cybersecurity that's new information for me today. And I know that when I was in OET in 2016 under Secretary King and the leadership of Joseph South, the questions that were asked of us were always around K-12 cybersecurity. So back in 2016, and that was one of the things that we all talked about, what keeps us up at night. And it continued to do that even when I was in that position. And that was why we intentionally brought some folks in to be able to address that. So I felt like we had 2 steps forward and maybe we're going to go 1 step back or a little bit further. I don't know. That is something that I want to make sure that we talk and make sure that folks are aware of, particularly.
And that can directly impact a school, right? You can take a school
100%.
down and a community down for a couple
100%.
of days. And again, we see that same thing at the state level. Number one priority, cybersecurity, and how states are stepping up, but also how the federal government was kind of filling in some coordination of getting us all on the same page and helping also the sector, those folks that support those kinds of strategies and everything really understand our sector, because our sector is completely different than other industry sectors. I always use the analogy of like, two-factor authentication is considered a best practice and mitigation practice, but let's try that with a 5-year-old in kindergarten. That is the reality of the folks that we work with. So how do we tailor some of those mitigation strategies for our sector across the board? So you're not just taking an off-the-shelf sort of product and applying it to the K-12 space.
And now we've taken away all the cell phones from all the teachers and students.
You can't do two-factor anyway.
Can't do it anyway.
Well, it's fascinating. I can give an example of this. It's really speed of adoption of newer technologies and being able to keep up with that. And the oversight of the Department of Education and organization like the NCES is Common Data, but then also the Common Education Data Standards are crucial. Having that oversight is crucial to getting the standards bodies to be able to adopt and to provide equity across whichever standards the technologies are using. So it's not that the market won't get there, but it will take much longer. And that, I believe, is a good example of how you slow down progress and you slow down the adoption and opportunities. Also a place where maybe philanthropies can play a role, so they could help in that with when they're out. I'm going to shut up for a second. I want you guys each, if you could, provide some guidance to those that are out there in terms of what are the right kind of proactive or contingency plans that should be put in place, or protective steps that can minimize the impact of this instability. And I guess that's really the way we should describe this is causing instability. And what's the best way to prepare to minimize that or be prepared to react to the instability that's very real right now?
Can I go first?
Sure.
It's actually the same advice that I've been giving for years now, which is if you're in the classroom, start to know what's happening at your local school board. And then if you are in a district, and whether you're a district decision maker or classroom teacher or anywhere in between, start paying attention to what's happening at your state board of education as well. There are places for you to start to advocate, to make sure that folks know what's happening in your districts, what's happening in your schools. And that is like a huge thing that many folks can easily do.
It's important to help become an advocate and help policymakers understand what the value of these investments are. So we'll be launching the next day or two at our conference a strategy or a message to let your congressman know what's happening with the loss of CISA support through MSISAC. So, we will also have messages around E-rate that'll be happening later this spring. So check out our website for how to do that. It's pretty easy.
And I know that my colleague and myself just published an op-ed, I guess it would be, about what states can do right now, because we want states to feel like the responsibility is coming to them and what they can do to help maybe mitigate some of the uncertainty and just create a little bit more stability for themselves. And we've been advocating for this for a while, and we will continue to do so. It's a long-term policy thing, but really have a dedicated officer leader that is sitting in your cabinet that's reporting directly to your state chief around educational technology, not necessarily your CIO. It could be, unless your CIO is really well-versed in the K-12 sector. Often at the state level, though, you have somebody that comes from another state agency that doesn't quite understand, again, the sector that they work in. But to help have somebody there that can just create some statewide strategies and help secure some funding and do some of those coordinating efforts amongst their districts, but also amongst their offices in their own agency. And I know that professional learning tends to be the thing that gets cut right away when it comes to shrinking budgets and everything else. But technology is only as effective as the teachers that use it. And if you want to make sure that your kids are successful when they leave your system, they need to be using technology, and those impactful technology professional learning experiences for educators need to be part of the puzzle. This is not the time to cut that, is what I guess I'm trying to say, is
Yeah.
you want to almost double down and make sure that you're helping those folks. That includes coaching around AI, that includes digital literacy, digital privacy, and whatnot. And I will plug for me and Keith, there's a bunch of us at the national level, like engage with your national organizations from whatever perch that you're in. If you're a computer science teacher, there's the Computer Science Teachers Association. If you're a CTO, COSIN is the place to go. If you're at the state level, CETA would love to have you be engaged. But we want to make sure that you're utilizing us, because we're in the space and advocating on your behalf. And we can go farther together if we join forces and advocate for the things that we know we need for this space.
And the CETA, COSIN, ISTE, SIA are all collaborating on a fly-in to DC. So, consider participating in that. Join us to talk to your member of Congress so that they understand how these things impact your school district.
I'm going to try to now summarize kind of some key takeaways, and I'm not so sure that I'm going to do this very well, but I'm counting on you to listen to what I say and make sure that you fill in any gaps. We've talked a bit about the Department of Education, and there are some things that the Department of Education does, particularly it focuses on equity and oversight and research, but it doesn't act alone. It's required to have statutes behind it and funding for those statutes behind it. And it's just one piece. The majority of education oversight has always and will always occur at the state level in support for the local school districts and the education, the direction and guidance as to how that direction or how that education policy is played out is largely, almost exclusively already done by the states, with some support by the federal government. The states are not necessarily able to just fill in the gaps with what the federal oversight groups have done or Department of Education has done. And there's a great disparity between the different states in terms of how well they will be able to step up and get involved. This also isn't just a red and a blue issue by state, and it isn't just the Department of Education and the LEA and SEAs that are impacted by it. There's a business community around supporting education, one that provides an influx of capital into this market and supports a lot of innovation, and also is desperately needed for the technology gains that education can use. So we want to make sure that everybody is aware that it's far greater than just a red and a blue issue. We've learned a little bit from occurrences where this has happened where changes in policy have happened in the past with NCLB and others, but it also, we can look to other countries and other examples of where they have created better systems than what they had before based upon an event or based upon a drive to do so. And it sounded pretty positive that there's a place where philanthropy can really play here. I think it's also important to state that this is more of a disruption than it is a right and a wrong issue. And the fact that things change and they're changing so rapidly and without forethought, without the preparation, kind of magnifies it. And I think in some degree brings out greater fear. There was a mention of this disruption opens the door because there's an opening, because there's not consistency for changes in things like cell phone bans and other activities like that or beliefs like that can be very disruptive. We talked a little bit about what should we be doing? And I think the key takeaway there is education is just too important. You have to have a voice. Find a way to inform that voice, find a way to exercise that voice. We have wonderful examples of organizations you can get involved with here to help. And most important, I think, when it's all said and done, a balanced approach, a thoughtful approach is the one that's going to produce the best result. How far off did I go? What did I miss?
It was fabulous. The only thing I would just add is it all comes down to trust. And if we don't have the trust of parents, policymakers, the community, we're not going to get very far.
Well said. Very well said. I want to thank you all. I love spending time with each and every one of you any chance I get. So I'm thrilled to have you all here together. Hopefully our audience takes some key takeaways from this. I'm sure they will. I did. I thank you very much. For those listening, look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. ClassLink is proud to be the meeting place to facilitate these conversations. If you have a topic idea, send it to perspectives@classlink.com. To keep hearing our perspectives, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.